Welcome to the Sacred Birthwork and Business podcast, where sacred birthwork meets soul-aligned business. I'm your host, Anna Lundqvist, a former midwife, now sacred birthworker mentor, business coach, and the founder of Sacred Birth International. My intention with this podcast is to inspire you to follow your birthworker calling and to step fully into your power and purpose and unapologetically claim your place as the feminine leader that you were meant to be in your life and community. Let's reclaim sacred birthwork, let's reclaim sacred business, and let's do it the feminine way. Let's begin. Hi, and welcome to the first episode of the Sacred Birthwork and Biz podcast. My name is Anna, and I am your podcast host. And this first episode, I really want to introduce you to me and to who am I to talk about birth work and business. This is a brand new podcast, but I've actually been a podcast host for over 5 years now. I started the Natural Birth podcast about 5 years back, 2020, where I interview women around the world who have had a positive, empowering natural birth and want to share about it. That podcast really is a guest podcast where it is the women's show. And I just interview them and pop in and out as a former midwife, now mentor of birth workers, an educator of natural childbirth and nursing postpartum education. Now, this podcast is really a heart project. This podcast, I'm going to bring all of me. If you are watching this podcast episode on YouTube, you can see my living room in my midwich cottage in the countryside of Sweden. You'll see my little dog, my little puppy, Beans, in the background. He'll probably pop in and out throughout the episodes in the background, sleeping on the couch or playing with a toy maybe. And so I'm bringing you into my home because this podcast is not like a typical business podcast or maybe doula or birth worker podcast. This podcast is going to be so infused of me, my life, my experiences, and I'm going to marry sacred birth work with sacred business. And I'm going to weave it through a feminine lens. How we as women, because most birth workers are women, most doulas and midwives are women. And we have been taught, I'm speaking from myself as a former midwife who have gone through university studies and also the training that accompanies that in the hospital system and in the maternity system. It's a very masculine way of learning and studying, and it's very hardcore. And if you're listening to this and you're not a sacred birth worker, one of my mentees that I teach, in my sacred birth worker mentorship, if you're not one of these women, that most of you who are doulas and other kind of birth workers probably have gone through a very kind of masculine way of studying and being certified and the old paradigm, really. Well, I'm here to kind of bring in the new paradigm, the new earth, birth rebellion, doing things from a feminine way, which is very kind of new to both men and women, approaching, especially as women, the way we live our lives, the way we do business, the way we show up as birth workers, from actually being this cyclical being, this feminine being who moves through each month, through the seasons, who also, depending on where you are in your life season, recognizing that, are you a maiden, mother, maga, or crone? And approaching our work in the world from that place. So yes, this is definitely a kind of different podcast. And so welcome. Welcome to this space. And I hope that you will enjoy hanging out with me here in my living room with my little doggy Beans. And as I share with you about the purpose and soul calling of birth work, birth as a sacred rite of passage, um, and business is also sacred, to be of service. That's how I approach business. And so, this episode, I would love to start the journey of letting you get to know me. Who am I? Again, who am I to talk about these things? So, I'm going to take you back to the early days and walk you through it. And hopefully, throughout my story, you'll get inspiration and insights, and maybe also recognize a bit of you. Because it tends to be that way, that when we share authentically who we are in the world and share our hearts and what we are passionate about and our service to the world, we will attract soul aligned clients, students, people. So if you're watching this or you're listening to me on your favorite podcast app, then I'm sure that you're a bit of me and I'm a bit of you. And maybe parts of my story or who I am feels a little bit like you. So who am I? Well, my name is Anna Lundqvist. I am Swedish originally. I lived many years, as you will hear about my story later, many years abroad, especially in Australia. In Australia is also where I became a midwife. And so you might hear that in my English. I do tend to change my way of speaking depending on who I speak with. And nowadays, I speak a lot of Swedish, but also I speak to a lot of Americans, and Australians and New Zealanders and Europeans, but primarily I would say Americans. So I think today my English probably sounds somewhere between a mix of Swedish influenced American, Australian, maybe. I don't know. You tell me. Tell me in the comments. What do I sound like? So I am Swedish. I now also live back here after so many years living abroad. And I live in this old, old cottage on a piece of land that I get to be a custodian of, that I love to spend time in when I'm not interviewing for my podcasts or recording or teaching my students in my sacred birth worker mentorship or in my business course for birth workers or I'm out at a birth or working in my community with women and holding circles. I tend to be in my garden. I tend to be creating beautiful spaces in my home and in my garden and on my land. That's my favorite thing to do in my spare time. I'm quite a little hermit. My human design, if you know what that is I am a hermit leader, which really suits me, or hermit teacher, maybe. Um, and because I've spent so much time being out in the world, teaching and also accumulating a lot of wisdom and holding space for lots of people. And as I returned to Sweden, I stepped into my hermit era, and now I'm very much the little midwitch in the woods. And I call my cottage the Midwitch Cottage. So that's a little bit of me. I am many things, but today I would call myself, a former midwife turned midwitch, because I was a registered midwife and then I deregistered, and now I no longer hold a registration as a midwife, but I'm stepping into and have stepped into the role of mentoring birth workers through my own signature program, the Sacred Birth Worker Mentorship. And I also coach birth workers, midwives, doulas, who want to step into business deeper. Because if you're working as a doula and if you're working as an independent midwife, you are a businesswoman. But many doulas and midwives, many birth workers don't really know how to be a businesswoman. So I'm here to help them out. And I do that through the business course for birth workers. But my journey, of course, started way before I became a midwife. And I want to take you back to that journey today to give you a little bit of an insight where I come from. I've always been a bit of a weirdo, let's be honest. I've always been a bit of an oddball, especially here in Sweden, where I've always been very intuitive and just by nature spiritual. And Sweden is a very secular country, both when it comes to spirituality, but also religion, both of them. And if, especially as I was growing up, I'm 39 now, so things are changing, but I think it's still very strongly in Sweden that if you would say that you're a spiritual person, not even religious, just spiritual, like we are spiritual beings having a, physical, earthly experience, right? Well, if you would say that to someone, then they would think you were crazy or in a cult. So, I mean, I've always been this person, so you can imagine being young and being like me. And so I searched very early on for my people because I did not feel like I belonged amongst my peers in school. I did not belong or fit in. I didn't find people like me there. So I was searching from a very early age of 14 and found, women in their 40s, 50s, where I could sit in women's circle. I went to learn and grow and learn about yoga and healing modalities and sitting in circles of women very early on and learning from much older women than myself and feeling like I belonged there. I decided my last year of upper high school, which we call gymnasium in Sweden, when I was 17 to drop out my last year. And I went and studied nature medicine. I learned about herbs and massage and all these alternative therapies and Chinese medicine and Ayurveda. And that really informed me very early on also how I then led my life, very much from searching for the natural, normal to me ways instead of what kind of is normal in our society today, which is very much the unnatural in all ways, shapes, and forms. And so that began very early for me to do. And I just was so hungry for information and to learn, to fill my cup about all of these things. And I guess finding what to me felt like the most natural, normal thing in the world. I then did have a few years of, because I've always had this very strong kind of right and wrong um, sense in my being. So I wanted to learn more about how to help people and serve people. I'm a Virgo. If you're into astrology, I'm very much a Virgo, and being of service gives me the greatest pleasure and the greatest joy. And that took, you know, it's way with me as an 18, 19, and 20-year-old to study social work. I was very involved in homelessness and helping homeless people and immigrants and illegal immigrants. And I was working with different projects with the Red Cross and was very involved politically. And I then also went into human rights at uni and I studied that. And these years, I succumbed to just the darkness of the world. After having that beautiful year of studying nature medicine as a 17-year-old, I stepped into this other world where there was essentially it just showed me there was no human rights. It was just on paper. And I killed myself trying to help people around me and I had so much guilt for being safe in Sweden. And not having a hard life compared to the women and children and people and men that I was helping through the Red Cross and all my projects I was involved with. And And so I made myself sick. I got a really bad pneumonia, could barely breathe. And I went with that for a few months. It got really, really bad before I finally collapsed. I developed like panic attacks because of all the stress I was under and all the stress I felt inside about wanting to save the world, really. I was very, very disillusioned that time. And that, hitting the famous wall was really the biggest blessing for me because it made me stop. I had to stop. And it made me sit in winter by the ocean and realizing that I could not continue the way I was doing and living, just giving all my time and energy to trying to help and save everyone around me and absolutely neglecting myself. What I did do that year, though, was going to yoga. And specifically for me, that was Kundalini yoga. And for me, devotional singing has always been medicine, all kinds of devotional singing. It just opens my heart, puts me in devotion. And those hours I was at the yoga studio was my saving grace. But I knew I couldn't continue that life. So I left Sweden for the first time for a long time and never really fully grounded back until now when I'm living here again. So I went to Australia to travel around. I spent a year there. I spent time working as a tourist guide in Venezuela. I went and worked in Norway. I spent time in Thailand and I entered back into Sweden to study again, then massage therapy, spa therapy, and life coaching. And I became a yoga teacher. And then I started my first business. So after gathering all of that kind of wisdom and knowledge throughout those years of studying, I opened my first little business. It was an organic day spa in the center of Stockholm. I just got that opportunity. I jumped at it. I had been living in the countryside, in the woods for a long time, and that is truly who I am. But I thought, let's try it. Let's try the capital city of Sweden, Stockholm, in the center there. And I opened this little day spa that I ran for about 1.5 years. Um, it was never my thing. It was never what my purpose was, but it was a good I mean, I learned a lot, right? I definitely learned about the taxes and that kind of side of business, running a business as a solo entrepreneur. But I was terrible at marketing, at selling myself or anything. I barely made ends meet. It was definitely this trial and error, as I was 24, 25. So, it was a crazy endeavor. It was interesting. I learned a lot, but it was never my thing. And I left to become a consultant and to work as a yoga teacher and massage therapist for another retreat center for half a year before me and a good friend of mine decided to start a yoga house. So we moved up into the middle of the forest where I had studied, and we lived upstairs, and I had a yoga shala downstairs because it was mainly me teaching, and I held maybe 5 classes a week. And there I started to also host women's circles and women's workshops. From the knowledge I had, I created these Shakti workshops, Shakti circles, where we would um, do like detox, or we would do dancing, or we would do um, feminine embodiment stuff that I'd learned from the yogic training I had, but also just from being in this world, this kind of quote unquote alternative world. When you're like me, you know what I mean with that, like going to festivals and retreats and learning a lot from just participating and being around people and teachers for years since I was 14. And having sat myself that early in circles, I kind of brought all of that to this yoga house that I called House Harmony. And I also did this for about a year and brought community together. It was beautiful. I met a lot of beautiful people, but I was only at this point like 26 and I was too young to be in the forest. I was still too restless. My nomadic feet was too restless. I wanted to travel. And also my friend who I lived with, she met a new man and moved away, and my relationship fell apart. So after a year, it was kind of the time to just let that go and move on. And this time I decided to continue the path of doing women's work. So around 26, I was at this time, I think. And so I went to Thailand to do this training that taught me for 2 months straight. I think we're studying 8 hours a day for 2 months or something like that. Very intensive women's business, women's work. I learned all kinds of sacred dance around the world from different traditions. We learned a lot of rituals and ceremonies for women. There was part of it that was women's tantra and Jadic practices, and really connecting with your feminine body, nourishing the feminine sexuality, expression, working with archetypes. It's really fully embodying being a feminine creature on this earth. And I was in love and I loved doing this work. So after that, that became my world. I started traveling as a nomadic workshop leader, and I held what I called temples. Later on, that became the Temple of the Mystical Feminine. And I did that for years around the world. And I ended up going back to Australia. First, I went to New Zealand for half a year and I did this work. And then I went to Australia. And as I came back to Australia, and I haven't mentioned that, but I was back and forth for years during this time. I returned, I think I was 28 when I returned to Australia. And I'd already been back 3 or 4 times for long, extended periods of time. But this time was different. I came back and I came to Byron Bay, where I'd passed through before, but I hadn't really stayed. And this time was different. It's like it was just time. And I arrived and I just didn't leave. I was so embraced by the community. My work was so embraced. My temples and retreats and workshops filled so easily. And it was really meant to be. During these years as a traveling workshop leader, I was following my heart. I was following my intuition, which I've done throughout my life. And it led me to different countries, different places, different cities. I was asked by groups of people and to come and hold these women's retreats or spaces. And it all just flowed beautifully. And I was living in this very harmonious way where money was coming in and I was able to live and be and thrive wherever I was. And it was really just very organically happening. When I came to Byron, it just really solidified here was the place for me to hold this space. And so I spent the next 6 months there until I realized that I'm not going anywhere. And that is the time where I really felt called to midwifery. And this is going to be where we pick up in the next episode, my call to midwifery. I hope you enjoyed the beginning of my story, seeing how I'm a person that has had so many different interests. I've studied so many different things. Maybe you're this kind of person that just have a lot of interests. And maybe that is also how your 20s is, or 20s has been, just collecting and learning. And maybe you're also a traveler or just someone like me that's highly sensitive, very intuitive, and following your heart and everything. And if you are, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening to this first episode. I will meet you in the next one. Thank you for listening. If you love this podcast, then please share the love on your podcast app by leaving a comment or pop over to our Instagram at Sacred Birth International. I'd love to connect there. If you'd like to know more about the Sacred Birthworker Mentorship or the business course for birthworkers, then head on over to sacredbirthinternational.com to learn more. Thank you for listening.